So please give him a warm welcome.
So I need to apologise first because I did a practice dry run of this with some of my colleagues at HMRC last week, and it went okay, but I decided over the weekend it needed a bit of oomph, so I looked at ways I could spice it up. And the latest cool thing, of course, is these video scribes where you've got a little hand that draws the stuff out for you and the canvas moves around. So it would be really cool if I could do that. And I spent the best part of Sunday, well, it was a really nice sunny day, trying to do this thing, much to the disappointment of my wife and children, who obviously wanted me to do DIY jobs and play and stuff like that. And I got about as far as slide 2. So this is what... So this is 5 or maybe 6 hours work. And admittedly, you know, like with the AWS experiment, there's a learning curve. And next time I would get beyond that, I would get further. I'd maybe get to slide 3 or 4. There's definitely mileage in this, but unfortunately not tonight. So that's that, and we're kind of back to we're back to Google Slides. So yeah, I'm Tony Heap. I'm freelance. I call myself a business analyst designer. Again, if you want to know what that is, ask me in the pub afterwards. Do a bit of agile coaching. I do a bit of training. I'm an associate with Equal Experts. We're a UK agile consultancy. We've got some work in the north, some work in the south. And in my spare time, I do some blogging on my blog, itsalldesign.com. So that's me. Let's talk about you guys. So hands up if you're a developer. Hands up if you're not a developer. Oh, more not developers than developers. So hands up if you used to be a developer, but things have changed so much that most of the TLAs in the last presentation meant not a lot to you. No, I'm not saying it wasn't good. It wasn't good. It was great. But it's oh my God, I do know what a Docker is, or what Docker is, but anyway, beyond that. So that's me, that's you guys. And this hopefully will have fewer TLAs in it, and it'll be very generally applicable to anyone who's working in agile development. So, there's always one, isn't there?
Yeah, genuinely.
Okay, so we're going to talk about stories. So I'm going to present my objective and plan as a story in reverse. So normally as a story, I can so that. So the so that bit is the objective. So the objective of today's presentation, so that, is to take you guys from being a novice story splitter. You see the analogy there, that's a guy with an axe, and turn you into something a bit more like that person over there. Precision scalpel cutting, slicing of stories. So everybody knows about story splitting, but in my experience, it's really, really difficult to do it well. So I'm going to talk about basic and advanced techniques, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to learn about splitting stories. So what are we talking about here? That's a very, very basic stuff. We'll get done that quick. Why? Not always what you might think. When? And most importantly, how? What are the techniques? And in particular, I've discovered over my time as an agile business analyst that there's certain techniques that I can apply fairly repeatedly in a specific sequence. So I'm going to talk about that. So very, very quickly, a bit of a recap. Should be teaching you guys to suck eggs, or your grandmothers to, yeah, you know what I mean. So what are user stories? Okay, so for me, a user story is a unit of scope, a unit of delivery. It's something I'm going to deliver. And it's going to deliver something useful, okay, and valuable, and user visible. So making a change to a database isn't a user story. Something that looks different to a user is a user story. It provides some benefit, some value to them. And as I mentioned, we typically use the as a, I can, so that format to describe a user story. So as a consumer, I can sell stuff on eBay so that I can make money. Okay, just for example, very high level story. And you may be familiar with the INVEST. So this is an SLA, isn't it? A 6-letter acronym as it applies to user stories. So a good user story is independent. Is independent. So stories aren't dependent on one another. Negotiable, so not set in concrete at the point where it's invented, but up for discussion. Valuable, as we said, so it's no point delivering something if it doesn't give value to some user somewhere or some stakeholder somewhere. The stakeholder is usually the end user. Sometimes the stakeholder is someone else. So the stakeholder in a security based story might be the business itself protecting itself rather than the user. It might be two-step verification, which a user might find prohibitive rather than a benefit, but it's protecting the business or protecting other users. Estimable, so I can get a team together and we can get an idea of how big that story is, okay? So there's enough unambiguity in it to allow me to do that. Small enough to deliver several stories in a single sprint if you're scrummy, or in a short period of time if you're Kanban. So we split them up so we can see progress, deliver stories quickly. And finally, testable. So often we talk about acceptance criteria on stories as being a way to specify what it's going to look like when it's done and how we can test that it actually achieves the value that we're aiming for. So if it can't be tested, it obviously isn't doing anything for a user. So these are often kind of trotted out as if they are the kind of holy grail of stories. But my experience is that it's very difficult to get all of these at the same time. And in particular, there's definitely a trade-off between small and valuable. So the smaller you carve up stories, the less valuable they get. And also, the smaller you carve them up, the harder it is to keep them independent as well. Okay? So I tend to see invest as being a set of guidelines rather than a set of commandments, as it were. But good guidelines, useful guidelines, nevertheless. When did I start? 10-2, 5-2? Okay, right. Right, so that's what are stories? We've done that. So why split stories? Okay. So this is where I throw it out to the audience. Okay, why split user stories? They might be too big. Thank you. You fell perfectly into my trap. It's not a trap because that is a right answer. You want to make them small enough to deliver quickly. Okay. But for me, there's a more important, or an equally as important, if not more important, reason to split stories. Okay. And it's this. In every project I've worked on, there's always high-value stuff and there's low-value stuff. So teams, stakeholders come up with great ideas, and I use the word great in inverted commas because they come up with lots and lots of ideas. It should do this, it should do that, it should have a cat, it should be blue, it should be red, it should be shiny, or whatever. And depending on the forcefulness and the authority of that stakeholder, then that feature potentially makes it onto the product backlog. And not all ideas are good, believe it or not. So some ideas turn out to be high value and low cost. Some ideas turn out to be low value and high cost. And in the good old days, or sorry, in the bad old days of waterfall, all of those, we used to call them requirements, didn't we? All of those things went into a big spec, and then we built everything. And maybe we did Moscow on those things, but everyone always ignored Moscow prioritization, just built everything anyway. And a lot of projects failed. I'm not saying projects aren't still failing, but a lot of projects failed, and I think that one of the reasons a lot of projects fail and have failed is because of the failure to weed out that low-value stuff from the scope, okay? So splitting stories, and you'll see as we go along, and iteratively carving them down and carving out that low-value stuff and quietly pushing it down the backlog is for me possibly even more important than making them small enough. So you may have heard of the Pareto Principle, also called the 80-20 rule. So the last 20% of what you've got to do takes 80% of the time. And there is a graph that I've drawn to demonstrate that. So imagine that you have taken your backlog and you have organized it, sorted it perfectly into high-value stuff first, and then tapering off value as time goes on. So as you start to build stuff, then, oh, hang on, I've got a laser on here, haven't I? I don't even have to walk up to it. Oh, that was weird, wasn't it? I pressed the laser, and then suddenly, is there some kind of crazy Bluetooth thing going on there? I don't know. Okay, let's get back to that. There. I don't know whether to press the laser again. Should we try it again and see if that happens again? It does. Why is that? I'm not going to use a damn laser. What a stupid idea that was. Right, forget the laser. I'm going to walk up to it and point at it. So, Yeah, so if you had your stories nicely in order, then you would see value soaring as you delivered initially, but then it peters out. So, you've delivered 80% of your value in about a quarter of the time. The blue line is kind of, ooh, that was spooky. Was that you? I'm fine. I don't need the laser, man. I'm going old school. I'm going, forget that whole scribing thing. PowerPoint slides is the future, the past of the future. So yeah, your perceived value is you're going to be finished there, but you aren't. You're like, you got there. Yeah, we're nearly done. We are nearly done. Honestly, we're done tomorrow. And then, you'll continue to be nearly done until you're sunk. Okay, so that's the Pareto Principle. Kills projects. And that's why it's really, really, really important to split stories and to split them well. Okay? If you don't remember any of the rest of the stuff tonight, just remember that one thing. Okay, and that's the biggest. I'll give you that for free. Okay? Okay, that's why. Now, let's talk a little bit about story, hierarchies, and epics. So, I'm a little bit cart before horses here, I suppose. So, I'm assuming that I haven't talked about story splitting yet, but you already know what it is. So, just in case someone doesn't, you take items of scope and you split them, and you split them, and you split them into small bits, and you deliver them one bit at a time. That's the general principle, okay? And it's a hierarchical thing. So you start out with a big story, and then you split it down into some smaller ones, and some smaller ones, and some smaller ones. And some people and some teams have gone to great lengths to define hierarchies. So they say, right, the very, very biggest stories, we'll call those epics. And then the next level down, we'll call those features. And the next level down, those are capabilities. And then the next level down, those are the stories, okay? So we've got to split down to that level. Now, I find this overly constraining, okay? For me, there's no fixed hierarchy, or not one that works especially well. So I like to say, well, in fact, Mike likes to say, I agree with him, a story is a story is a story. So you take a story, you split it, you've got some stories. You take one of those stories, you split that, you've got some stories, okay? They're all stories, and it's hierarchical, as I said, but there's no fixed level. That one might split into three, and that one, you might say, that's small enough already, to your point, and also there's no kind of mixture of high value and low value that I want to split out any further in that one. But these ones here, they'll split even further. That one will go down to there, that one will go to there, and that one will go to there. And I'm not going to get caught up in thinking about, have I got to story level yet? There's no such thing as story level. There's only small enough or split to the just right, like the Three Little Bears, yeah, just right. But I do still use the term epic, okay? And all that means, and again, this is sort of similar to what Mike Cohen said, is an epic's just a kind of almost like a colloquial term that just means a story that either has been split or that story that looks like it needs splitting. It's big enough to want splitting. Oh, yeah, that looks like an epic. That we need to split it, okay? So my advice is don't get too caught up in all of these hierarchies and terms. Just stick with stories and use epics to mean one that needs splitting, yeah? And that kind of brings on to the next question as well, story traceability. So once I split a story, do I care about the parent anymore? Do I care where those stories came from? So on the one hand, no, I don't. Once I've split a story, the parent is of no interest to me. I'm only interested in the things I've got to deliver. So there's an analogy with rocks. So if you take a rock and split it, you've got rocks. The parent rock isn't there anymore. It's just become the smaller rocks. Parent rock? That just doesn't work, does it? So there you go. I knew I was going to say that. But on the other hand, maybe yes. So what I tend to find is that groups of related stories, it's useful to group them and track them as a group, so that you can kind of see whether and when you've got to the point of delivering this bigger thing that you originally thought of. So potentially there is. However, you get a bit unstuck sometimes because you've got this epic, okay, this epic, this epic, this epic, and you split it into a few things there, and that was your original thing, and then you start building those things, and then you realize, oh, do you know, I need to change that, I need something else, an extra bit, or I need to change it. So you put together another story, and then you go, oh, so do I need to link that to that original epic? But that wasn't split from those original. This is a new one, so is that on its own? Oh, I'm a bit confused. So there's another concept, which is themes, okay? So it's basically a tag on a story. So you could tag all your registration stories, whether they're epics or stories or big or small or whatever, with the theme of registration or sign in or do stuff one or whatever. And so, yeah, well, what is my point here? Don't get too caught up on traceability, I think, but also do get too caught up on traceability. That's my point. It's a very mixed message, I know. And then the other thing as well, and you know, I'm gonna use an example to talk about the MVP flag thing. So, back on tracking themes, the danger then is that some management person, I was going to say bean counter, but there may be managers in the room. I've already met one delivery centre lead in the room, so you can't be too careful. But here's the point, right? They may say, well, look, so when are we done on registration? And almost immediately that means, when have you done all of the stories in registration? Oh, hang on a minute. Some of those are low value. I didn't really want to do them. So you have to be careful to not get caught in that trap of grouping things together and then being committed to delivering all of them. So it sometimes becomes a good idea to go registration MVP, or a registration MVP and registration of the stuff that we probably won't do for a while. And I think I'm going to be able to demonstrate that on the next slide, but hold on. Story mapping as well. So anybody heard about story mapping? Anybody use story mapping? Yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about that because that's probably a whole hour in itself. But that's another way of grouping stories into groups or themes or whatever and tracking them. And so here is the most sophisticated of my slides in that it sort of animates, okay? It's not got a pen scribbling thing, but it sort of animates. So on my current project, we're using JIRA. Anyone else using JIRA? So JIRA out of the box has a kind of two-level hierarchy thing. You've got epics and you've got stories. I think you can get plugins that do different hierarchies, but we kind of start, well, I struggled. You see, I've talked about my struggles with epics and stories, and now I can't even stand up. And I'll talk you through how we kind of manage this in JIRA as a practical example. So let's say I had 4 epics, okay? Register, sign in, do thing 1, and do thing 2. And then I did some splitting on my first epic and came up with 3 slices. And then I did some more splitting on slice 1 and came up with 2 more sub-slices. Now, as I said, JIRA doesn't support, so JIRA allows you to link stories to epics, but it doesn't allow you to link stories to epics or epics to epics. You can't do a multi-level hierarchy, so you can't actually do this. So you can create these stories, but the only thing you can do is link them back to the parent epic. So, so what we tended to do is delete that one, so that's the parent rock that goes, and those things end up linking directly to that. So I've got my 2-level hierarchy back. Now I look at that and go, oh, hang on a minute, let's prioritize those. I realize that those 2 want to be prioritized the other way around. So that's my priority order. And then I realize that, hang on a minute, out of all of these stories in this epic, the top 2 are the ones I really want to do first in my register MVP, if you like. So it's not my product MVP, it's my epic MVP. So I draw a dotted line there, and then I say, right, shuffle those ones down, create a new epic, call it register phase 2, rename that one register phase 1, brackets MVP, and then relink those stories to that one. Very, very complicated, admittedly. Those are the sorts of sleights of hand we've had to do on JIRA to try and kind of manage stories and epics and prioritization. And then, but the most important thing then is to take this phase 2, which I don't want to do really till probably after these things, and move it down there like that, you see? So I've kind of, the ultimate effect is that these 2 low-value stories, I've shuffled them all the way down out of the way. Did that make any kind of sense at all? Oh, good, at least 2 or 3 nods. Right, so my pain with JIRA. Let's move on. How far to go? So, what's the right size? What's just right for a story? And the answer, of course, is it depends. So I've found that every team I've worked with has been slightly different, and even a single team I've worked with has changed over time. So when we've started, what do? You form, don't you? And then you storm. So I would create stories and split them down a bit, and then I'd go to the team and we'd do 3 amigos or story reviews or estimation or whatever. And the guys would go, no, those are too big. Those are too big, split them down some more. And we'd split them down a little bit more using some of the techniques you'll see in a bit. And then I go, okay, I get that now. I know what level of stories you guys like to work at here. So the next iteration, I come back with stories just the right size. And they looked at them and went, no, those are too small. Make them bigger. Because we've got better now. We're more confident in ourselves. We can probably deliver. Our velocities increase, right? So we can do more. We don't need the stories to be quite so fine-grained anymore. And I've never found a hard and fast rule for what the right size is. It depends on your team, on your sprint duration, or if you're running Kanban, what the team's velocity is, and it just comes with trial and error. That's my experience. But in the last slide called Discuss, I'm going to ask you guys on your experiences as well. I'm going to make sure I get all my talking done first, though, in case I run out. So, on your team, sprint duration, trial and error. So that was how big. When to split stories. Easy peasy, just in time, okay? So, that's less vague than it depends. So the whole point here is that you don't split all your stories at the beginning of your project, okay? And here we go, here's the diagram. So this diagram, and by the way, a load of other good ones as well. In Illusion, a guy called Ken Rubin, who wrote the book on Scrum, the big thick book on Scrum, has got a load of downloadable graphics that if you do presentations like this, you can use them for free and they're great. And this one is the one that I really like that illustrates a backlog. So your product backlog, the stories at the bottom are bigger because you haven't yet gone into the detail of them and analysed them. The stories near the top are smaller because those are the high priority ones. Those are the ones you're focusing in on. And so you've worked on them, you've split them down some more. So they've become better specified, they've become smaller. They've become, they've got test criteria against them, all those sorts of things. They've become more investy, I suppose, up towards the top. So you can see, for example, somebody is doing a piece of work to look at that story there because they thought that looks like it needs splitting down. It's split into some smaller ones there. Some of them might float up, some of them might flow down, some of them might go in the bin, etc. But you do that just in time. You want to have enough stories ready for dev as your team can consume. So if you're working in sprints, and I usually find myself working right up to the wire, getting enough stories ready to go into a sprint planning session. If you're working Kanban, then again, I'm trying to be just ahead of the team, but not too far ahead because of the concept that the decisions go stale. Okay, so trying to keep the decisions as late as possible. So yeah, just in time. Not all at the beginning. Okay. Minimum viable product, a fairly standard term. I can't remember what I had to say about this. Let's find out. What shall we deliver first? So that's the key point as well, isn't it? With Agile and incremental delivery, you don't ever have to say to your stakeholder, "What do you want to not deliver?" Okay. What's in, what's out. All you have to say ever is, what should we do first? Of all these great ideas, some of them are shit, some bad ideas, all these great ideas, which ones should we do first? What are the highest value ones that you want to get out to your users first as quickly as possible? And we'll call that an MVP. That's exactly my point. So saying what's in the MVP is implicitly saying what's out of the MVP. It's the do later bucket. But it's not a do-never bucket. It secretly is a do-never bucket, but it doesn't look like one at the time. And that's the most important thing. No, that is really, it's a funny psychological trick because if you say we're not doing that, then whoever argued for that in the first place, who's emotionally invested with that thing, they'll argue till they're blue in the face that that's the most important thing that you could possibly want. And you waste so much time in these arguments about doing things or not doing them. If you just say, yeah, of course, Bob, Jane, Tom, we will do that thing just a bit later, and you probably both secretly know that it's never going to happen, but you never have to say it. Yeah, so even kind of in these enlightened days of Agile and product owners that understand the Agile process, and everyone does it, people tend to over-prioritize things. So, you know, I don't know if anyone else has been in a situation where an MVP looks like it's got stuff in that isn't really minimum. But that kind of doesn't matter because if you also do stack ranking within your MVP, so that's my MVP, but hey, these are more minimum than the other ones. And if you also set a deadline that says, oh, this is going out in March, then naturally the MVP line will get redrawn when it gets to February the 28th. And everyone goes, oh yeah, I don't think we're going to get all that done. And then we rethink about which things really must go out in March. So that's really important. An MVP is a good kind of device to get a ready reckoning on what's going to go initially, but the stack ranking is really important. So don't fall into that trap of thinking, okay, all these things are in the MVP, we can do them in any order. Yeah, don't do that. Just be really focus on doing the highest value stuff first. And this isn't a talk about prioritization, okay, but just very briefly, highest value sometimes means highest risk. So you may choose to do stuff first because it's risky rather than because it's high value. And mitigating that risk has value in itself because you fail fast or you discover stuff that gives you more certainty about what you're trying to do. Okay, so I'm not going to go into prioritization in the detail, but if you just assume when I say highest value and most important, I mean all of those things that's in my other talk. Do I have another talk? I could do that next. I don't think I've done prioritization. Did I do that last time? I can't remember either. Okay. Anyway, so revisit periodically. So if you build an MVP, as I say, time goes by, things change, things seem more or less important in the harsh light of a looming deadline. So do revisit MVPs periodically, especially after you split a story. So the whole point about splitting register down, so register clearly is in your MVP because you can't, well, maybe it's not, but let's imagine it is. Register's in your MVP, but then you split it down and then you go, oh, hang on, out of these 4 stories, I'm not going to put them all in the MVP just because register was. I'm going to look at them all independently and say, yeah, those first 2, they're in. The second 2, maybe they're not in the MVP. So it's iterative. You split, you reprioritize, you split, you reprioritize. You kind of go around in circles like that. Virtuous circles, hopefully. Yeah, what I said there. To move the low value bits out of the MVP. That's what you're trying to do all the time. So back to that point again. The whole point about doing this is to carve out little bits of low value and punt them to the right, downwards, down the backlog. The backlog goes down, doesn't it? Does it go down? What do you think? Or across? Hands up for down. Hands up for across. Yeah, it goes down. It goes down. Straw poll. Right, next bit. So we talked about invest and stories being unambiguous, but when they first start out, they tend to be quite ambiguous. You've just got a 3-line statement, as I can, so that. That is effectively your business objective and roughly what you want to do. But my experience is that if you give that directly to someone to code, then they'll go, well, I don't really know what I'm doing here. You need to do some thinking first about what that would be. In the good old days, we called it business analysis, and now we call it writing acceptance criteria or BDD scenarios. But it's all about working out what to build before you actually build it. And you also need to do a bit of working out what to build before you can split the story, right? So with just 3 lines, it's kind of difficult to say, how am I going to split that down? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So I've found that it's worth understanding the scope of the story before trying to split it. But doing just enough analysis, so don't go to the nth degree, you do just enough that allows you to make the split. And then you iterate, because then you can, for each of those stories that you've split into, that goes onto your backlog, you can then, when the time is right, just in time, do just enough analysis on each of those individual stories. Okay, so it's leaving it till the last minute, doing it just in time. And I've got myself a little process, and this is very un-agile, drawing a process diagram, because that smacks very much of big methods and lots of documentation, things like that, but it's not. So here's what I like to think of for each individual story. A story gets requested, so somebody says, I've got this great idea for the product. It needs to be green, it needs to have a cat or whatever. And when they say it needs to have a cat, they don't really mean that it needs to have a cat. What they probably mean is that it needs something cute and fluffy in it, for example. But what they ask for is a cat. So on goes, a cat goes on the backlog, not an actual cat, but a request to have a cat. An actual cat on the backlog, that would be silly. So the request for a cat goes on the backlog, and that gets prioritized. And if just on the basis of cattiness we think that's a low priority, it might sit quite low down on the backlog, probably asleep. The analogy is working well. Until such point as it gets woken up by becoming the most important cat on the backlog, and at that point we then go, okay, let's do that kind of what the heck is this cat thing going to be? So when you said you wanted a cat, really what did you mean? Well, I wanted something soft and fluffy. Well, why? Because then people will love this product more. The analogy really isn't working, is it? But the point is you do that whole, what are you really trying to achieve? What really is your objective? And then what are the different ways we could do this? And then, okay, so maybe we need a dog after all, not a cat. And then, oh God, I'm going to end up splitting a dog now, aren't I? So, all right, let's go down. So then once we understand that it is a dog, we can talk about the best way to split a dog. Would it be... Can we change it from a dog to... No. Okay, well, look, so you get the idea, right? You need to understand what it is you're going to build before you can split it, right? And then in my little three-phase analysis thing, design is acceptance criteria. So once I've split that dog into legs and heads and stuff, then acceptance criteria for a leg would be, I don't know, it has a foot, it could walk, it's got a knee, it's brown, whatever. But the point is that, so do a bit of analysis, understand that you want a dog, not a cat, before you split it, okay? I think that was my point. Didn't really expect to end up there. But that could work really well on the scribe thing, though, couldn't it? The drawing of the cat cross? No? So, right. Where are we? We have talked about... What did we just talk about? Analysis first. All right. Vertical story slicing. So again, when anyone talks about splitting stories, usually the first thing they say is, oh, whoa, you don't want to split... In a West Country accent, you don't want to split your stories horizontally, you want to split them vertically. Let me show you with my cake example. So, plate, layers of a cake. And those layers represent, oh, that was supposed to come on when I clicked the button. Yes, the architectural tiers of your application. So, in this case, it's a user interface, could be an API, like your example was. UI, middleware, data. And the general idea here is that the tendency is would be to take your cake and say, oh yeah, Bob's good at data. He can go build the data layer. Let's go build the data layer first, and then Steve over there. Well, we'll do the middleware next, and then we'll do the UI. Or well, we'll do the UI first, all of it, and then we'll do all of the middle layer, and then we'll do all of the data stuff. And that's horizontal slicing, and you don't get any value, or you don't get very much value until you've done everything all the way through your layers. So vertical story slicing says, okay, so if this is the whole of my application, then register being one function on that application is a slice through that cake. It's got a bit of UI, it's got a bit of middleware, and it's got a bit of data. So in my first slice, I'm going to eat. Now this is where the analogy breaks down, okay, because you're building software, you're not eating software. It's not like there's a software cake to be consumed. There's a cake to be built. And you do not build a cake with vertical slices. You actually build a cake with horizontal slices, don't you? So it's actually a very bad analogy. But put that aside for a minute. Imagine you are constructing a cake or eating a cake in reverse. Then you would construct that cake, if it were software, not a cake, and indeed not a cat nor a dog, you would construct it vertically. So you would build slices like that. And if you split register into register via web, register via iOS and register via Android, then you've done some story splitting there, and you would go, do you know what? Register via web's our highest priority, so we're going to build that little thin slice there vertically first. Okay? So there you go. I built that slice first, then I build that slice, and then I build that slice. Or maybe actually I build that slice and I leave the rest of registration for now and move on to something else completely. Now, vertical story slicing is often described in terms of mitigating your architectural risk, okay? So I want to be able to build something that demonstrates my ability to build full stack. For me, that's a bit geeky, actually. No, that's not quite true. That is not quite true. So architectural risk, I do get that. But I'm most interested in delivering user value or customer value. So for me, the reason for building vertical slices is I get to demonstrate something that actually works to a customer much sooner than if I was, doing it across like that. So I'm focusing really on value, and the fact that I get architectural risk mitigated at the same time is a bonus. Now, that means then that if I uncolour my cake again and I decide to re-eat my cake, I can actually do something that's not talked about in vertical slicing, and I'm glad, Stuart, that you mentioned this in yours, because that ties our two presentations nicely together. So you talked about building the UI first, back-end stubbed out, then adding in your code layer with no database behind it, and then finally adding your persistence in. Now that, for me, is a great strategy, especially when you're just getting started on a project, your very first piece of functionality, to try and build something that traverses all the way through those layers in one story in a few days is probably quite a big ask. So hey, why not do the UI first? I can show that to my users and get some value in terms of feedback, because it may not work. It might be smoke and mirrors behind it, but they can look at the colours and the feels and, oh no, I wasn't expecting it to be like that at all. So even if I've only done one slice through, I can get some value. And then when I come to my next story and I've learnt some stuff, maybe I'll do the UI as a story, but then middleware and data, I'm confident that I don't need to split those out, so I can do those together now. And then by the time I'm doing my third slice, bang, I'm all the way through the stack in a single story, okay? So the moral is, do split vertically, but don't refuse to also split horizontally, okay? But if you split horizontally, work from the top down. That's a different top from the product backlog. A cake, I guess, also slices down as well as a backlog. That could be confusing, but there are only 3 dimensions, 4 if you count time, I guess. So we'll just have to deal with it. Story slicing. Now, here's something that, how are we doing on time? We're not doing too badly, actually. Here's another way of sort of looking at the same thing, splitting stories, okay? I talked before about the idea that you could split stories as many times as you wanted to get them to the right level, and that there wasn't really any kind of fixed hierarchy. So I'm now going to slightly disagree with myself in that I'm going to argue that there's a kind of defined level somewhere in here that's called user goal level, C level or blue. Now this is definitely true because it was originally proposed by Alistair Cockburn, one of the Agile manifesteurs, and also extremely smart guy. So in his book, Writing Effective Use Cases, so before BDD was the way to do it, use cases were the way to describe system behavior. So he was talking about use cases, but the same thing still applies. There's a certain level of user story or use case that represents a single user in a single session doing a thing, okay? So in this example, which I think is probably eBay, I've got an epic called sell stuff. So as a consumer, I want to sell stuff to make money. Now, if I split that down into functions that I might do on an auction website, then registering is one thing I've got to do. And once I'm registered, in theory, I could walk away, okay? I'm done for the day. And I could come back another time and list an item. It doesn't make sense to partially list an item, although you can save for later, admittedly. But listing an item is kind of an atomic business transaction, if you like, a thing I would do in one session. And then likewise, later I might come back and check my item status. It's a one thing I would do in one session. So Cockburn talks about those goals as being at C level or blue level or user goal level, okay? Anything above that is summary level, so it's a grouping of user level goals. And anything below that he calls sub-function level, which it sounds ever so old-fashioned these days, doesn't it? Sub-functions. I'm programming BASIC using sub-functions. But you can see, like, for example, I split register into enter registration details and submit them. So entering them without submitting them, I'm not done, okay? And likewise, entering my name without entering my address and then submitting, I'm not done. So anything below that he called subfunction. Now, why does that matter? It does and it doesn't. It sort of comes into play in a minute because I'm going to talk about the different techniques and how some of the techniques apply to stories at a high level and some apply kind of at this level and below. But it's useful, and also it allows me to do what hopefully is an analogy slam dunk, okay? Because what Coburn says is that you can tell if you've got a user level goal story by using the coffee break test. So the coffee break test says, you know, you're in an office and you do 10 of these or 20 of these things an hour. Once I've done this thing, could I have a coffee break? If you can, then the story is at the user goal level. So the point here with the coffee break test is that if you eat a piece of cake that's just the right size, i.e. user goal level, then you can have coffee and cake. See what I did there? Tumbleweed. I thought that was really good. Come on. Fine. Right, so so we've done what, why, and when, and then some blabbing about slicing and cats and dogs and stuff like that. This bit now is the various techniques, okay? So everything's been general so far. I'm going to go into specific techniques, and as I said at the beginning, I've found that certain techniques I can apply them sort of in a sequence, okay? Now it's not a guaranteed sequence every time. So I'm going to present them in a sequence that I normally sort of try and apply them in, but bear in mind that, oh, hang on, I thought there were more bullets than that. It's not a hard and fast rule, okay? Nothing's ever a hard and fast rule. But here we go. There are 9 techniques. We've got 20 minutes. So that's 1 every 2 minutes, and there's a gag at the end. And we need time for discussion. So when do I need to, we need 5 or 10 minutes for discussion. Yeah. So it's 1 a minute. Okay. Let's go for a technique sprint. So the first one, and people often do this just by forgetting to think about NFRs, but very early on I like to say, okay, we're doing register. Let's just focus on the register functionality for now, and let's recognize that there's a whole bunch of non-functionals we will need to worry about at some time. Response times, volumes, concurrency, availability, security, accessibility, usability, cross-platform, internationalization. All of those things we will do later. I'm just going to create one NFR's epic that just says, do later, okay? Now, not too late, because, you know, with the crappy architecture, but not too soon, because you get bogged down with trying to deliver functionality and learn stuff. And there's always a balance. But anyway, I tend to do that quite early, so they're kind of on the radar, but we're, you know, every time the architect says, yes, but how's that going to scale? So it's all right, we're going to do scalability, but we're working on a kind of sub-MVP here, and we'll come back to that quite soon. Okay, so split out NFRs. Do that at a high level. You can do that at a high level. So, and the specific case of that is splitting by interface channel. So you saw my cake example. We had three different channels, and so I said, okay, we'll do browser first, and we'll do iOS, and we'll do Android later on. Okay, so focusing on browser, and I can then also say, all right, what browsers are we going to support? Chrome, Edge, and what version of Chrome we're going to support. Bad example because Chrome kind of rolls with its version numbers, but back in the good old days of IE, you could really pin your hopes on only supporting one version number and screw everyone else who was on an older version. Especially IE6, that was really hard to support, wasn't it? So yeah, you can split it right down just so you can focus in and give your testers an easy time with only having to test it on a single platform. Okay, so that's the next one. Next one, split by user type. Now this is a real example from a project I was working on 6 months ago, where registration, we had different types of users, and the registration process was different if you were a UK user or someone from the EU. This was pre-Brexit as well, by the way, or someone who was outside the EU. So we said, okay, let's focus on, and this, most people were over here, so let's focus in on that first. And then within UK users, I've got organizations and individuals. And again, most are organizations, let's focus in on that first. I've got incorporated companies, unincorporated companies, partnerships. There were others as well, actually. So choose one to focus in on. And there were literally about 7 or 8 different variants on this. And if we tried to do them all at once, it would have been too much. So splitting by user type. So now we're into summary goals into user goals. So this is back to the fish sea level, cloud level thingy. And I've had to segue. My analogy broke down because register is already a sea-level goal. So I had to choose a goal that was more of a cloud-level goal. So manage widgets is a classic example of a story that breaks down into CRUD, right? So I need to be able to create widgets and view widgets and update widgets and delete widgets. So I can break summary goals down into user-level goals that are coffee break test goals, okay? So I can create a widget and I can have a coffee. So split summary goals into user goals. Now, I've got user-level goals, okay? And there's a bunch of different ways I can split these down. The first thing I can do is split them by scenario or flow. So creating a widget could go well or it could go badly. So I can probably split that out into a happy path create widget that doesn't really worry too much about field validations and whether the widget is a duplicate of one that's in the database already. I don't want to do those validations straight up. I just want something that works for a happy path. If I put good data in, it'll work. If I put bad data in, the result is undefined. But I'm going to come back and I'm going to do duplicates and I'm going to do invalid data. So I'm focusing in on something that's quicker and easier to build. I don't have to worry about how we're going to do field validations. Yeah. So that's technique 5. Technique 6, a really good one: bronze plated versus gold plated. So stakeholders, product owners, and even team members always come up with a really, really cool way of doing things. It would be great if it had a flashing button, not a still button. So I often say, okay, that sounds great. That sounds like a gold-plated solution. So let's go bronze-plated first. We'll have the still button first, and then we'll put the gold-plated one on the backlog. And if we've got time, we'll do that really cool thing. We'll never do that really cool thing. So, for example, create widget, happy path. We want photos, but photos aren't the kind of be-all and end-all, or at least doing it with photos is too big a job all in one go. So let's do a version with no photos. And then let's do a version with one photo, and then multiple photos can come after that. Yeah. I'm splitting into a cheap and cheerful version and then a better versions. So now I'm getting into the phase that I call desperation. Not so much desperation, but really, if I start to split this story any smaller, I'm really losing value. Okay. So splitting, creating widgets into the individual steps. I don't get a lot of value out of being able to enter the details without being able to review and submit the data as an end user. I get learning value from putting it in front of my stakeholders and finding out whether it's right or not and it's usable, but I don't get kind of end user value. So I'm going below sea level here. I'm going to sub-function level. I'm doing things that are below the coffee break test. But first of all, I need to split things down so they're small enough to deliver quickly, because we like team momentum. And also, I may discover that when I get down to enter details, that I can, again, have a bronze-plated version with a very basic user experience, and then maybe I can have a silver or gold-plated version. Maybe it's got drop-downs with pre-selected values rather than free-format text, or something like that. Yeah, at every level in the split down, I'm always looking for opportunities to carve stuff out and kind of push it down the backlog a little bit. Every level. Yeah. So there weren't 9 techniques. It turns out there were only 7. I thought there were 9. Maybe I got rid of 8 and 9. No, there were only 7. So I suppose here I've kind of got into. I mean, you can go as small as you can, right? So enter details. You could say, right, there's 5 fields. I'm just going to do one field at first. And early on, when the team is still forming, they might want to carve it really small like that. As the team gets more confident, a group of 5 fields in one story wouldn't be a problem. So how far you go, as we said before, depends very much on the team. Yeah, we've zoomed through that way quicker than I thought, which is good. So yeah, techniques, and there's an order, but it's not it's not a rigorous, it's not a hard and fast order. You can mix things around a little bit, but some of the techniques apply more to bigger stories and some more to smaller stories. Now, spikes. Let's talk about spikes. Technique 999. So, it's often the case that we're talking about a story and it looks like it might be a little bit challenging, and someone, usually a developer, says, let's split out a spike. let's spike this, which usually, and the concept of that is, I don't want to deliver working software with a spike, I want to deliver knowledge. I want to understand a bit more about this problem. So maybe we can estimate it better, or we can choose how to do it. We've got a couple of options on the table. Now, there are some pitfalls though. My experience with spikes is it is sometimes the case that we forget to define the objectives of the spike very clearly. And we also sometimes forget to time box the spike. So you then end up with unstructured developer playtime, I like to call this. So it's like a developer saying, yeah, go and spend an unspecified amount of time on an unspecified thing. Have fun. And usually every day at the stand-up, they go, how's that spike going? Yeah, it's kind of, it's getting there. It's almost done. It's 80% done. And it just goes on for days and sometimes weeks. I've had spikes that have just gone on for weeks. And then you get to the end of them and the thing that's being delivered isn't necessarily really what you're after anyway. So I'm not against spikes, but what I prefer to try and do is put context around the spike. So rather than saying, yeah, just go play with that thing, I'll say, okay, let's look at the vertical slice of actual real functionality that if you were to attempt to deliver that, that would deliver the knowledge, first of all, but it would also give us some nice, clear, focused boundaries on the scope of the spike, and also might deliver some working software, some actual value as well. And here's the gag. And my mother always told me, be careful with spikes. Geez, you're a hard crowd. And that's why it's technique 999 as well. You see what I've done there is 999 is at the bottom of the list of numbers. It's not actually, there are numbers bigger than 999, but it's certainly bigger than 7. And also, it's the number you call if you have an accident with a spike. So, in conclusion then, we've talked about why you would split stories. Getting stories small enough is only part of the story. Splitting out low-value stories, that's the big benefit for me, okay? When, just in time. How, vertically, as we've talked about. Iteratively, so keep doing it again and again, and keep splitting out the low-value stuff until you can't do it anymore. Decomposing user goals down into smaller and smaller bits, and keeping really focused on value. So just constantly saying, is that thing going to be valuable? Is that thing going to be valuable? Let's do that thing because that's going to be really valuable. Okay, and a variety of techniques as we've talked about in the right order, which means not that there is a right order, but you get the idea. Some apply higher level, some lower level, and that's it. That is it. So now, discuss. So I'm really interested to hear your feedback, guys. I want to know what your experiences are with story splitting. If you feel free to contradict, because this is only my experience and my thoughts on it, and if you've got any questions. So I just at Christmas I came up with this idea that people might want to learn how to do Agile stuff better. Distance learning course. It's on the blog. You can read about it, and that's me.